I'm not gonna sing a song, man. It's not gonna take it that far. What is that term they call it? Post-traumatic stress syndrome. That thing that soldiers would get. I think a lot of people get that. It's like when you experience something and it affects you for a long time afterwards. I guess everything works that way. Certain things have more impact than others. Sometimes it visits you in your dreams, or when you're quiet, just at peace, or trying to be at peace. A lot of soldiers get it. A lot of common people get it. Most of the time, common people are soldiers. That's just the way it works out. This is a soldier's dream.
The Worthless Negro from Virginia, Gus T. Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the global system of white supremacy, information for non-white people, victims of white supremacy. Again, individuals classified as white do not need to listen to the cows to better understand racism or to produce justice. Today's date, Wednesday, July 30, 2025. So I have been told. Now, broadcast for today. Long tradition of discussing the plight of black soldiers, military personnel within the system of white supremacy. We have many, many programs in our archives over the 16 years examining many instances of racism, white supremacy in the armed services. The incident that we're talking about today, we talked about the first time around with author Jamie Salazar, Mutiny of Rage, the 1917 incident where over 100 black male soldiers, privileged, were convicted. About 20 of them, about 24, were actually executed, hung, for their alleged participation in this mutiny, and many of them convicted, jailed, all of that. Really disgraceful incident of white supremacy, racism. We talked about that with Mr. Salazar not too far back in the archives. The documentary film Black Soldier Blues, we had the white Australian filmmaker as a guest on the program in 2013. Same thing, really. That's World War II, but black soldiers executed, this time cowbell. Can't be touching no white woman, even in Australia. We had Professor Robert Allen as a guest on the program. And this is an oldie, but tremendously important. He wrote the book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, where same thing, and these black males could have been executed. They had the first round of black males where they had white officers who were gambling and making bets on whose niggers could move bombs the fastest. And then they had an explosion, killed about 300 people. And so then the next round of niggers said, oh, no, workplace safety. And they said they mutinied too. Really important incident, the Port Chicago Mutiny, which is a California incident. I know it's Port Chicago, but Port Chicago is actually in California. I thought about going out there when I was visiting California last year. Anywho, the program today, the white author was at Elliott Bay Books right here in Seattle. I think over our 16 years, and especially over the last 5 years or so, last 5 years or so, I have tried to take advantage. They have so many different events where white and non-white authors come out here to talk about the system of white supremacy, racism, sometimes very explicitly. And so if you look in the archives, N.D.B. Connolly was just here. He was a guest on our program, and they just had him at the University of Washington. And it's not just the university where they had these events. I said today, this was at a random bookstore. You know, they have a lot of independent bookstores here, and so they have events and town hall meetings. And the white people in Seattle, they do not sit inside watching TV. They abide by what Gus T say. Reading nonfiction is more important than streaming, Netflixing, YouTube, and screen time, all of that. Reading nonfiction. This here is why Gus T is not concerned at all. I don't care what you watch on YouTube or TV, unless it's news, current events. not some random YouTuber talking, whatever, some Negro you like listening to. I don't care. Reading is more important than watching television. The book today, and Gus T, what'd he say? He said all non-white people, because we are so poorly informed, to compensate, we should all read at least one non-fiction book that was published the current calendar year. At least one. So that means all of us should have at least one book that was published 2025 that we have read or that we are excited to read. And it's July, so it should be a hefty chunk of us that, hey man, Gus T, cross me off that list. Already done it. Already. In fact, I done read 3 or 4 books that were published this year. Don't need no help from you, Gus T. Right on. Dr. Welsing would be proud. I'm going to add to your list today. So the book today, John A. Haymond, White Male Suspected Racist. He has the book Black Soldiers, White Laws, The Tragedy of the 24th Infantry in 1917 Houston. Now, as I said, I was familiar with this subject matter because we had Jamie Salazar as a guest on the program. So, okay, I'm excited to hear more about this, and importantly, because counter-violence. For years, all of my life really, I have heard many non-white people, victims of racism, say proudly with lots of volume that we black people, and particularly black people here in the U.S., are so cowardly and yellow that we just take whatever whitey dishes out. They come and smack us around and smack our mom around and grandmother and our children, and we don't do nothing. We just take it because we are the biggest chumps and wussies in the world. I've heard this like for years and years and years. That is so inaccurate, incorrect, and it is so disparaging to the legions of black people, these privileged black males right here in this here book, Black Soldiers, White Laws. Not at all. They did not sit around, woe is us, we just no count shiftless black dude. Nah, we gonna go down here and put down some white people, kill some white people. We train soldiers. We know how to shoot. Come on. And I mean, that's long list of black people who believed in and practiced counter-violence. Killed some white people. Maybe killed many white people. Anyway, and since we had the audacity to talk about oppressive black males oppressing black females this week and patriarchy, it was lovely to be reminded that the 1917 so-called mutiny in Houston, Texas, with these black male soldiers, privileged, it did not start with these black males saying, we're going to look out for our other black brothers, and you don't mess over Leroy, and what you say about Jamal, and I got Devontae's back. That's not how this started. This started with race soldiers going to smack around a black female, just what I said, a black mother in front of her children who was semi-nude. And these privileged black males, they didn't come and say, oh, we're going to help you oppress her. We're fellow male supremacists. They said, what are you doing to that black female? Why are you manhandling her? And then they came and almost killed these black soldiers for coming to have the uppity audacity, call themselves semi-protecting a black female. Get out of here. But that's also why I think this is important. Counter-violence, and then hey, they were trying to do the right thing by black citizens and themselves, by black females and themselves. Anyway, this talk, I've been to Elliott Bay Books many times over the years just to go and get books and to hear many authors. They're in the archives many times. This event was not well attended. Now, you could blame this on a lot of things. It was relatively hot today in Seattle, and to put that in context, it was about 82 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature in Seattle is 77 degrees, so it was about 5 degrees warmer Fahrenheit than what it normally is here. I mean, but it was not like, oh my God. Well, people did say that, oh my God, I'm going to die. So people do say that when it gets like 75 degrees or above here. But I mean, anyway, I think most of you, or many people in the United States, would easily trade a daytime high of 82 degrees for today, July 30, 2025. I think most folks would trade that, hands down. Anyway, but It was not well attended at all. I sat on the front row by myself, and it was not because, ooh, I don't want to sit with no nigger. Whatever. I got there kind of late. Dig it down. My day. I got there kind of late. I got up early. I started my day with a bang, metaphor. I got me a Thai Monstera. Now, people that have been listening to the cows for at least 30 days or so, they know I got into houseplants this year. I adore Monsteras. That's why I said if you want to give me the Mary Kay Letourneau support type treatment, if they ever come and accuse me of embezzling crypto and raping 50,000 white women, hey, Brother Gus, I got your back. We got a vegan roast beef sandwich for you. And to brighten up your spirits, we got you 2 or 3 of those Monsteras that you love. They're kind of big plants, so you just need one, really. We got you one of them albino Monsteras that are so expensive, and you want to add that one to your collection. There you go. Brighten up your spirits. Get a little whitey for you. Right? Anyway, so I start my day with my Thai constellation Monstera. So, I'm feeling relatively good. I go and get a nap after I'm so excited, I guess, after I get my 3rd Monstera. And so I wake up at 6:30 p.m. I'm in the U District, University of Washington Library. I wake up. I'm startled. The talk is going to be at 7 p.m. I said, oh, my goodness. I might have missed it. Maybe the Monstera will be all the fun I can have today. But I said, man, it's 6:30. I think Seattle has pretty good public transportation. I get up, wipe the drool from my mouth. I walk to the link, U District, get to Capitol Hill, and I walk past the rat painting in Cal Anderson Park. We just been reading about Mary Kay Letourneau and Rat City, which is White Center. I'm in Seattle proper, and Cal Anderson Park, they have a portrait ode to the rat. I walk by that, and a block away is Elliott Bay Bookstore. I literally walk in, and I go to the front row, which is totally vacant, at 6:59 p.m. I told you I was asleep at 6:30, got myself up, got together, and me and my Monstera sitting front row by ourselves to hear John A. Haymond. Now, he reads a little bit from the book. He has a brief bit of questions with the moderator, and then they go right to the audience. Gus T sat front row. I get my questions in immediately. I learned quite a bit from this talk, even though I did know about this event, even him talking about the resistance that they had to revealing truth about what happened here, and definitions, very important. There was a privileged black male who was seated on the front row to the left of me at this event. I think he was the only black person who was present. I might be in error, but he was the only black person who was present who was not accompanied by a white person or chatting it up with white people, like as a part of a group after this was all over. Like, it literally seemed all of the non-white people who were present for this talk were accompanied by white people, just had white friends, whatever the case may be, all of them, it seemed. I did not chat it up with any of the non-white people victims of racism at this event. Me and my Monstera, kicking it tough. Anyway, so I asked my questions, stood in line, said, man, I want to see if we can get Mr. Haymond as a guest on the program, because I thought he had a lot of constructive information to share. Go over, get the information, email contacts. We'll see if we can speak to him down the road. The young lady, suspected racist, who works at Elliott Bay Books, she heard that I, have a podcast, wanted to interview him, that I've interviewed authors about this subject before. She gives me a free copy of the book, a free signed hardback copy of the book. I lost it. One, because I had the digital copy, so I was ready to roll, and they said there's an audiobook of this. I was like, maybe I'll listen to some of the audiobook. But man, to get gifted, and it's got like pictures and all of that glossy, and it's signed. I think I'd said before in the archives that I have a book collection that I really cannot lend books, because so many of my books, I won't say so many, but I think more than 10% of the books that I own have come from authors and such. So I have like signed books from Pam, and a signed book from Dr. Martin Kevorkian, signed book from John A. Haymond. So yeah, I can't really lend out my hardback books, because I'd have to even go through to make sure that the book has not been signed. This one has a sticker on it, so thankfully I know. Signed copy, do not lend, borrow, whatever the case may be. This is a show-off copy. Anyway, I might not even highlight this copy. But I said, man, this can't be too bad of a day on the plantation. Like, I didn't get arrested. I didn't get shot. I didn't have conflict with any victims of white supremacy. I was not. Oh, I did get called a name briefly. Hey, what can you do? But I did not have loss of major property. I got a Thai constellation monstera. I was able to hear the talk I intended to, even though I almost overslept for it. And I got a free signed copy of the book. Other than replacing white supremacy with justice, and there were some cute young ladies, non-white, at the bookstore, which is normally the case. That's why I said, forget all that nonsense about painting and moving furniture and landscaping for a summer job. That is retarded and anachronistic. There we go. That's really, really lame and old school, 19th century thinking. Get a job at a library. It's air conditioned. They might have authors come in and speak. If you're a young dude, they always have attractive young ladies at the bookstore, library. They will need help. There you go. Anyway, it was grand. Like I said, what could be, and I left the bookstore now with a free book and my Thai monstera. I go to get my snack to wrap up my day. Black female at the Co-op grocery store. She says, I am into history and reading. She tells me about her day, please. And she says, I'm into history. I said, oh man, I was just at the bookstore and the author was there. He gave this talk and I got the book and I pulled it out and she flipped. She took a picture. She was so inspired. She said, I have been studying about racism and slavery, and I have been trying to read more and learn more about our history and what white people have done to us and how things got to be this way. Wow, I need to get that book. And so she had this. And then, of course, since I just mentioned it yesterday, Dr. Wayne A. Wiegand in Silence or Indifference, because I said, man, white people have put so much energy into keeping us from being able to read or to have books. I love to be able to pull out a book written by a white man and say, Exhibit A, bang. And she was so happy I was able to flip that book open. I was so proud I was able to flip that book open and it had lots of highlights. I interviewed the author, which I told her, but highlights. I didn't just, whatever. I read this one, but I flipped to the portion of that book in Silence or Indifference where it has the white librarian gleefully holding hands with a white student in blackface. He's dressed as Uncle Remus, and they all look so gleeful about this. And this is at a book fair at the public school. Reading is more important than watching television. We talked about that very photo with Dr. Wayne A. Wiegand earlier this year. I think that is it. Oh, and not even local history. I can't say enough local history. If you are connected to Texas, Houston, shout to Devontae. If you are connected to Houston, Texas, you should probably have both of these books. Black Soldiers, White Laws, and Mutiny of Rage. This is such an important event, and it involved so many black people. The whole town. It is such an important event. You should probably own them both. They have lots of footnotes, current information. I'm always, it should be blasted the same way. As embarrassed as Gus T was to come on here and say, man, Mary Kay Letourneau, I've been hearing bragging about being in the 206 all these years in Seattle, and I don't know nothing about Mary Kay Letourneau. Shame on you, Gus T. Same thing, man. You cannot be. I was born in Houston. I spent time in Houston. I got family in Houston, and I don't know nothing about the 1917 mutiny. Shame on you, because the cows did our part. You could have listened to the program. Now you got two programs, so we did our part. Study local history. And within the talk today, he was dropping other books because they mentioned the Port Chicago Mutiny, and I dusted my shoulders. I already know about that one. Move on. I really already know about the 1917 event too. Move on. But I did not know about the 1943 event of this very same thing. Privileged black male soldiers being accused of mutiny right here in the Puget Sound region. I said, what, in the Mary Kay Letourneau? He said, yup. I said, is there a book about this? He said, oh yeah, and it's well researched. And you know who wrote it? You know who wrote it? Can't be ignorant about racism if you're classified as white. Am I supposed to give the book title to that one just in case folks, might be interested? That one is On American Soil, How Justice Became a Casualty of World War II. That's the book about this event happening here in the great Washington State. I didn't even know they had enough black people here in the Puget Sound area in the 1940s to have them be accused of mutiny. Like, what in the Mary Kay? Man, I got to get that on my bookshelf like immediately right now. But I guess one at a time. So I got my one plant today and my one book today. Black Soldiers, White Law, the Tragedy of the 24th Infantry in 1917, Houston. We will get to the talk. Context of white supremacy. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing say, reading and writing is more important than watching television.
Do you see me?
All right, hello everyone, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us here at Elliott Bay Book Company. My name is Sophia and I'm Elliott Bay's event manager. And tonight we are pleased to welcome John Haymond in conversation with Abby Driftall, here to discuss John's new book, Black Soldiers, White Laws. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We'll have time for questions following the conversation. They might also be interspersed without, is what I hear. This will then be followed by signing at the table in the back, where you can also, of course, purchase copies of tonight's book. And if you want more of these events, you can sign up for our newsletter or check out our full calendar on our website. Now, without further ado, John A. Haymond is an award-winning historian, author, and educator. His work focuses on the fields of conflict history, racial justice, and the history of military law, especially at the points where those subjects intersect. He was the lead historian for the Clemency Project that in 2023 overturned the convictions of 110 African American soldiers who were executed or sentenced to prison as a result of 3 racially biased trials in Texas during Jim Crow segregation. Black Soldiers, White Laws is the story of that historical case and the long search for restorative justice. He teaches history in Tacoma when he isn't busy writing, arguing with his cat, or hiking his way around the Pacific Northwest. A Pacific Northwesterner by birth and disposition, Abby Driftall has lived in Washington, D.C., Oregon, Japan, and most recently the beautiful Pacific Grove, California, before returning to her roots in the Seattle area. By day, she works with international admissions and teaches history to unsuspecting teenagers, and by night, she writes books and travels to far-flung places. She loves to be with animals, read, play sports, and drink more London Fogs than is likely good for her. It is a great honor to have these two with us here tonight, so please join me in welcoming John and Abby.
Thank you all for joining us so much tonight. So we are actually going to start with a reading of John Haymond's choice, and then we will get into questions.
So the question is, microphone or no microphone? Microphone. I was speaking at a conference once in Britain, and I was the lead speaker, which was funny because I was the least important person. Nobody knew who I was. I had no credentials. And as we were walking in, one of the staff came up to the director of the facility and said, "We have a problem. The PA system's not working yet." And the director quickly looks through his agenda and says, "Oh, we may be okay. Our first speaker's an American. He won't need a microphone." So if I have the microphone on the podium, is that loud enough? Okay. Before I start, one of the things I would like to explain is the fact that everything in this book is meticulously researched and cited. But this is more than just a scholarly history. If I had relied only upon government archives, it would have read like a scholarly history and there'd be no soul to it. But I was really fortunate when I started working on this project to be able to actually interview relatives and descendants of the men whose story this is, which means that for the first time in the 107 years since this case happened, the individuals who are involved in the story, their stories are being told for the first time. And the book opens with one man's story, which will set the stage. For those of you who are familiar with literature, this is an in media res opening. And the idea, hopefully, is to give you the sense that these are real people. A century passed, but these are real people. They came for Jesse Ball in the dark hours before dawn on a cold December morning in 1917. His mother, home in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, had had a dreadful premonition that something like this could happen to him. African-American mothers in southern states knew this fear all too well as they watched their sons grow to manhood and venture out into a dangerous world, young black men in a society where Jim Crow overshadowed every aspect of their lives. A black man could be lynched for the slightest reason or no reason at all, and parents could do nothing to protect their sons from that peril. Jesse's mother told him that she had dreamt something terrible would happen to him if he had left home for another hitch in the army. Somewhere out there, she feared, something dreadful was lying in wait for her boy. However, Jesse loved being a soldier because he had already been one. At 17, he had enlisted into the 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the U.S. Army's Buffalo Soldier regiments of black soldiers in that era of racially segregated military. Serving in that famous unit with its proud history gave him a sense of purpose and new opportunities and sent him farther away from the cotton fields of East Louisiana than he had ever thought he could go. He traveled by train out west, sailed across the Pacific, and served 3 years in the Philippines. When that first enlistment was up, he took his discharge and went back home, but like many other young men, he soon realized that home had lost much of its appeal. Home was still the same, but he was different. He had seen the world beyond Jim Crow's oppressive shadow. When Jesse announced his intention to re-enlist, his mother begged him not to do it. She told him about her premonition, but nothing she said could change his mind. Jesse loved his mother, just as fiercely as she loved him, but he knew his own mind. All the same, he could not bring himself to openly defy her. So in the end, he re-enlisted without telling her. He signed the enlistment papers under his uncle's surname as Jesse Moore, and he re-entered the Army under a name that his mother never gave him so that she could not petition the Army to send him home. Now, here he was in Texas, far from home, and white men with guns had come out of the night and laid their hands on him. But at least he was not alone. 12 other young black men were hemmed in with him in a feebly lit room. William Nesbitt, Charles Baltimore, Thomas Hawkins, and the others. Jesse knew them like brothers, had soldiered and fought and risked everything with them. They were shackled with chains on their wrists and ankles and taken out into the cold darkness. Their captors lifted them up into the backs of trucks and drove them away into the night. Texas in 1917 had a reputation for horrific racist violence. Lynch mobs terrorized African-American citizens in almost every county in the state, and a gathering of armed white men in the night usually meant only one thing. With that in mind, one might naturally have assumed that the activity a few miles outside of San Antonio in pre-dawn darkness that December morning was another lynching in progress. After all, many of the elements familiar to Texas lynchings were present. A crowd was assembled, even though most of them were invisible in the darkness. From the clinking of bridle chains and the stamping of horse hooves, it was apparent that the place was surrounded by a cordon of mounted men. Light from a large bonfire glinted on the rifles held by men gathered around a hastily erected wooden scaffold 100 yards from Salado Creek. Anyone standing at the right spot could have seen the outline of a row of 13 nooses draped over a crossbar, silhouetted against the lesser darkness of the eastern horizon. The clandestine nature of it all, especially the darkness of the hour and the remote location, suggested that the perpetrators wanted to keep what was happening from public view. But other things about this scene did not fit the familiar script of a lynch mob. For one thing, all the armed men who ringed the scaffold wore khaki. An orderliness marked this event that one never saw at a lynching. There were no shouts, no confusion. None of these men looked angry, and no one was drunk. A grim solemnity overshadowed the entire scene. As the sky tinted with the first hues of the approaching dawn, a faint glow of electric headlights appeared in the distance. The trucks carrying Jesse Ball and his companions bounced and rattled over the rough dirt track that led out to this desolate spot near the old bridge spanning Salado Creek. This was no motley cavalcade of vehicles, as was usually used by hastily assembled lynch mobs. These trucks were all identical, new model Packards, all painted the same dull green color. The trucks pulled up a short distance from the bonfire-lit scaffold, and the armed men closed in around them. Jesse and his 12 companions were lifted down from the truck's cargo beds. They could not climb down by themselves with their hands manacled behind them, and the shackles hobbled them so they could only manage short, halting steps as they were led to the waiting gallows. Jesse's friend William Nesbitt had always been a leader in this group. Now he led them one last time. "Not a word out of any of you men now," Nesbitt said. There would be no pleas for mercy, no protestations of innocence, no displays of fear as they faced the rope. Whatever had brought them to this end, these men were determined to die with their dignity intact. Clearly, this was not the work of night riders or whitecaps. A purpose-built gallows stood there, not a looming live oak tree chosen as an expedient hanging tree. The spectators gathered were not a disorderly mob, and the arrival of the men who were about to die did not prompt shouts or jeers from the armed men who surrounded them. The social forces of law and church were also present. Several men in civilian clothes, wearing silver scars on their coats, stood off to one side, along with a black clergyman. The minister with his Bible approached the condemned men, but the lawmen remained apart, watching. If this proceeding was a matter of law, then it was a law in which they had no part. Jesse and the other 12 men were taken up the steps of the gallows. 13 chairs were arranged on the large trap door, 6 on one side and 7 on the other, and there they were seated. A uniformed chaplain mounted the scaffold to stand by them. As the nooses were adjusted around their necks, the condemned men began to sing a hymn, quietly, but without any discernible tremor in their voices. From his position below the scaffold, the man in charge looked at his watch, then at the eastern sky, where the horizon was tinting saffron with the approaching dawn. He spoke to the prisoners, who sat noosed and waiting, and they got to their feet in a jangle of chains. The chairs were removed from the scaffold. "Goodbye, boys of Company C," one of the doomed men said. He was speaking not to his companions, but to the white men who had brought him to his death. According to the almanac for that year, 7:17 a.m. would be the exact moment of sunrise. The officer below the scaffold, whose uniform epaulets bore the silver eagles of a colonel's insignia, kept his eyes on the face of his watch. In the stillness of the early morning, the men surrounding the scaffold could hear the chaplain praying quietly, his appeal to the Almighty, punctuated by the songs of early rising mockingbirds and the snorting of restless horses. The colonel raised his arm, held it for several seconds, and then dropped it. The long trap fell open with a crash, and all 13 men dropped simultaneously. One witness later claimed that he clearly heard the snapping sound as the nooses broke their necks. After nearly 30 long, silent minutes, a medical officer examined each of the hanged men for signs of life. They were all dead. Their bodies were taken down from the gallows. Then, an unexpected delay interrupted the grim process. Several of the hangman's knots had locked tight from the force of the drop, and nearly 20 minutes of effort was needed to work the nooses loose before the bodies could be placed in rough-sawn pine coffins. Slips of paper written with each man's name and the phrase, "Died December 11th at Fort Sam Houston, Texas," were placed inside glass soda bottles that were laid on their corpses before the lids of the coffins were nailed shut. The caskets were loaded onto wagons and taken down the slope to a wooded spot a few yards from the creek bank, where they were lowered into 13 waiting graves dug in a single row. Jesse Ball was buried as Jesse Moore, the alias he carried to his death. He was 27 years old. a long way from home, and his mother was never able to learn where her boy was buried. As a crew of Mexican laborers began shoveling dirt into the graves, the sounds of hammers and crowbars sounded through the morning. The gallows were disassembled, the timbers piled into trucks and carried back to Fort Sam Houston. By noon, nothing but mounds of ashes and hoof marks in the grass remained to mark the spot where 13 men had died. Just as the hanging was carried out under cover of darkness and secrecy, all evidence of the act was quickly erased from the site as soon as the execution was over. Down by Salado Creek, however, a row of 13 mounds of freshly turned dirt remained in view. In other cases, the graves of executed men had been despoiled by people seeking to add a personal measure of vengeance to the punishment of death, or by macabre souvenir hunters. A rumor spread that some local people were talking of digging up the bodies of the hanged men and burning them. That sort of desecration would not be tolerated here. An armed guard was placed at the graves day and night for several weeks, until the morbidly curious lost interest and sought other diversions. In the long, dark hours of the winter nights, alone at their posts among the new graves, the soldiers whose duty it was to keep that vigil later admitted that they were unsettled by the graves of the 13 men whom they had watched die at the first light of dawn. They called the burial ground Haymond Slough, and they did not like going there. The hanging that morning was not an extrajudicial lynching, no matter how many incidental similarities it might seem to have shared with a long list of racial murders that stained Texas's collective soul in that era. It was a formal military execution, and Jesse Ball and the other men hanged that morning were soldiers of the U.S. Army who were tried and convicted by a military court-martial on a charge of mutiny after an outbreak of violence in Houston, Texas, on the night of August 23, 1917. It was and remains the largest mass execution of American soldiers ever conducted by the U.S. Army in its long history. 2 additional court-martials over the next 4 months sent another 6 black soldiers to their deaths at that same desolate spot, adding 6 more graves to the 13 that the grass was slowly covering down by Salado Creek. But despite the veneer of legal propriety in those proceedings, the execution of those 19 men and the trials that condemned them are a lingering, festering canker in America's troubled history of racism and judicial inequality. The trials are also a disturbing reminder that the U.S. military's application of law and punishment has too often fallen short of fairness or the equal protection of law. Sometimes the law itself is the source of the worst injustice. For generations, Jim Crow segregation sought to use the force of law to restrict and oppress an entire race. This was also true of official military policies that for almost 90 years segregated and separated American soldiers based on the color of their skin, demonstrating over and over that black soldiers were not regarded as equal when they stood accused before the law. Civil authorities in Texas called the Houston incident a riot. The Army called it a mutiny. Neither description is completely accurate. But what is certain is that the causes of the tragedy run much deeper than the incident itself. This is a story of concentric rings. Houston lies at the center of it all, with Texas beyond it. It is surrounded by the American South, and still further beyond that, by America as a country during the First World War. It's the story of a city, a state, and a nation, all riven by racism. It is a story of laws and the point at which justice begins and ends, or never even existed at all. It's also the story of individual men and the converging paths that brought them to a point of fatal collision on a sweltering, stormy night in the city on the bayou. For more than a century, neither the people who died in the violence that night, nor the men who were punished for their alleged part in it, have received any redress or resolution. Nor did the descendants who still remember their names. No measure of restorative justice would come until November of 2023. 100 years or more after this incident, it's clear that the men who were convicted by those 3 courts-martial at Fort Sam Houston were denied the due process of law. The executions that followed their trials were not the culmination of justice. The Army charged them with joining in a mutiny, and nearly every commentator since then, even those who passionately have defended those soldiers' choices and actions, and have criticized the flawed legal process that sent 19 of them to the gallows and 91 others to prison, have assumed that a mutiny actually occurred. But newly discovered evidence And a deeper examination of the historical record leads to a surprising, disturbing conclusion. There never was a mutiny in Houston that hot summer night in 1917. Something else occurred, an entirely different crime, and the story of that tragedy has never been told before.
Thank you so much. You're a really good reader.
I've read to my daughter for the last 8 years.
You have a great voice for it too. But one thing I really appreciate about the selection that you just chose is the emphasis on something that we think about in history called microhistory. An emphasis on the fact that these are people. It's not just big events, but there's actually people involved, and you really focus well on the story of these individuals. But could you tell us a little bit more about what the Houston incident was? What actually happened that night, and what is the broader story here?
This is actually the hardest part to put down into a manageable synopsis. It's kind of like the elevator pitch, where you have to take 7 years of research and work and a case that has existed for more than a century and try to distill it into 2 paragraphs. But essentially, when the United States declared war on Germany in 1917 and thereby entered the First World War as a combatant, the first thing that the government had to do was create a large modern army that was actually prepared to go to France and fight in that industrial meat grinder of a war that was going on. The U.S. Army, when war was declared, was only 100,000 men strong. Now, that was the largest peacetime army the U.S. had ever maintained, but it was nowhere near big enough. So the first step that had to be done was to draft or recruit and then train a new army. So all over the country, cities were tapped as the location of new military training camps. 3 of them were created in Texas. The 2 most important for this story were Camp MacArthur in Waco and Camp Logan in Houston. Cities all over, especially in the South, were ecstatic when they got the news that they had won the lottery and they were going to be the location of training camp, because that promised infusions of millions of dollars of federal funds into their economy. That enthusiasm dimmed almost immediately when the Army announced that they would be sending regiments of black soldiers to guard the construction of the camps and guard government property while the camps were being built. Texas in particular is incredibly violently hostile to black men in uniform. There had been 5 separate violent incidents against African American soldiers from 1896 up to 1917. The officers of the regiment attempted to get their orders changed. The War Department said, no, we don't have enough people, so they're going where they've been ordered. They arrived in Houston in a city which on the surface seemed like it had all the advantages. Houston prided itself as an example of the New South. They like to brag that they had not had a lynching since the end of Reconstruction in 1873. But that did not tell the whole story. Houston's home to a dynamic African-American community of about 30,000, but they were incredibly restricted under some of the harshest Jim Crow segregation laws in the country at that time, and the Houston Police Department had a reputation for vicious brutality in enforcing Jim Crow segregation. And so, of course, 2 points very quickly create conflict between the black soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 24th Infantry, when they arrived in the city that July, and the law enforcement department in the city. One was the fact that these men in the Army had served in San Francisco, Montana, the Philippines. They had been overseas. They were used to riding in any seat they wanted on a streetcar. They were used to attending theaters and movies and restaurants with people of all colors. They played on sports teams with white soldiers of other regiments. There was no racial segregation. And suddenly they're in the South. And they refused to sit in the colored section of the streetcars. And quite often they would take the signs down that said colored only past this point, and they would dare the conductors to do something about it. This led to constant conflict. The other issue is that the white policemen in Houston lost no opportunity to use the N-word casually and directly, constantly. So it's a pattern that is developing over a period of 6 weeks of physical, verbal abuse, and it's all racially distributed. Rumors begin to spread that a black soldier is going to be lynched as a demonstration of Jim Crow superiority before the battalion leaves the city. They're only about 2 weeks away from leaving the city at this point in August. And then one afternoon, 2 police officers assault and arrest 2 black soldiers. One of them is one of the most popular young non-commissioned officers in the battalion. He's one of the military police in the battalion. He was completely blameless. Rumors spread that he's been killed. The fact that he's alive is not communicated nearly as quickly to the battalion as is the rumor that the police have killed him. And then another rumor spreads that a race mob is arming to move against the soldiers' camp that night. Now, this is 7 weeks after the East St. Louis massacre, the East St. Louis race riot. Have any of you never heard of East St. Louis? How many of you have heard of Tulsa and Greenwood? We think of Tulsa as the worst. Before Tulsa, you have Elaine, Arkansas, which is a horrific massacre of more than 200 African-American civilians. And then before that, you have East St. Louis, where maybe as many as 300 African-American citizens are murdered with the complicity of the police and the Illinois National Guard. All of that is the context. And so if soldiers in Texas believe that a white mob is going to arm and move against them, they're going to take it seriously. And at about 8 o'clock that night, the battalion commander, who is a paragon of ineffective incompetence, orders the battalion to be disarmed, which alarms them even farther. Then suddenly there's a rumor that the mob is coming. A shot is fired. Instantly pandemonium breaks out. The senior non-commissioned officer of India Company, I Company, takes what many people would say was an act of mutiny. He led his company out into Houston. The Army would later charge that he was marching on Houston to commit riot and murder and to assault the police station. I've walked the ground of that route. Nothing like that happened. They actually moved away from the nearest police station, and actually moved towards the black community of the San Felipe district. Because history had shown, and repeated experience had shown, that if a mob actually did form, the black community was just as vulnerable as any other group of people was. The battalion commander, whom by now you probably figure that I don't have a high opinion of, when the chaos broke out, he ran. He abandoned his entire unit, leaving it to 4 junior officers and a few sergeants to try to hold this entire battalion together in the face of just unmitigated chaos, panic, pandemonium. One of those officers was a young captain out of Virginia named Bartlett James. And his great-nephew?
Great-nephew.
Great-nephew is that gentleman sitting right there. He's one of the only 2 officers in the battalion that actually held his company together, and when the rest of the battalion was falling apart, Captain James's men said, "We stay with our captain." And they did. All of that leads to several hours of violence that night. 16 people are killed outright. About a couple dozen others are wounded. 3 other people will die of their wounds over the next several weeks. And this is what then creates a case of alleged mutiny and murder, and this is what is going to result in the 3 trials that lead to what we were just reading.
And we'll get to talking about the trials a little bit, but you've mentioned the mutiny versus the riot versus the incident. Can you talk a little bit about why this was not a mutiny and how long it took you to kind of really prove that particular point between being a mutiny, riot, or incident?
The problem with both riot and mutiny is that both of those words have very specific legal definitions. If you call something a mutiny under military law, if you're the military prosecutor, you no longer have to prove the individual culpability or guilt of each individual soldier. If you can show that one man went out with the others and somebody got killed, it's the same thing as felony murder. You know, if you're the driver of the getaway car and your accomplice goes into the bank and shoots somebody, you're still guilty of felony murder, even though you didn't know that was going to happen, even though you didn't pull the trigger. Under military law, if you charge a group of men with mutiny, you no longer have to prove the individual culpability of each person. And the prosecutors in 1917, 1918 used the hell out of that shortcut. They bootstrapped every single person They charged 118 men total in 3 trials. The problem is that in order for mutiny to be a valid charge, you have to first prove that a pre-existing conspiracy existed. And it wasn't until my research partner and I, Drew Brenner-Beck, she's a retired JAG colonel, until she and I started our research in 2020, no one had actually realized that the Army never proved that a mutiny occurred. They charged them with mutiny, they convict them of mutiny, and they executed or imprisoned them for mutiny, but they never actually proved mutinous conspiracy. Riot involves pillaging, burning, mass mayhem. These soldiers did not roam through the streets of Houston shooting at every white face they saw. That did not happen. That's exactly what was alleged to have happened, but that is not what happened. There are numerous incidences where they would recognize that a car contained women and children and they would let them pass, or they would stop somebody and say, you need to get off the street and go home, this is dangerous out here. Did they get into firefights with the police? Yes, they did. But they were not just out there burning Houston to the ground, and that is another false claim that was made very shortly after the incident.
And I have a long list of questions here, and I'm going to actually ask him one more, but then I also want to invite anyone in the audience to ask a question whenever you want. Please just raise your hand. I'm happy to call on you at any time. But before we get to that, if you could also just tell us a little bit about why this particular case and why you. Why are you the best person? Or why did this really stick out to you?
This may make me sound like an idiot. This is not the book
Never.
I set out to write. In 2018, I had just moved to San Antonio, Texas, where Fort Sam Houston is. And my 3rd book had just come out that month. And so I was already kind of thinking, well, what will I do for my next book? I had this idea that I was going to write a comprehensive history of capital punishment as used by the U.S. military from 1775 to the present day. This case was going to be a single chapter in that book. And it only took me about 3 months of research, because I was fortunate. I found a lot of people who had done decades of research and were willing to share their files with me. It took me about a day to realize that I didn't know nearly as much about it as I thought I did. And most of what I thought I knew was wrong. And then realized that this story had never actually been told. There's only one full book-length treatment of this that rises to the level of reliable history, and that was published in 1976. And at that time, most of the records pertaining to this case were still classified by the military. Now, I had 2 advantages. Number one, I spent 21 years in the Army myself. I know how the Army works. I know military law. I know how to manipulate the system to get them to let go of stuff when they've conveniently forgotten where they filed it. And I had a military clearance that allowed me to get onto posts and into archives and talk to people that otherwise would pretty much be out of reach of a lot of researchers. And then in 2020, after I had been researching this just as a history, the South Texas College of Law, in conjunction with the Houston branch of the NAACP, set out to try to achieve some measure of retroactive clemency for those men. The original thought was to try to get clemency for the first 13 who were hanged, those men that I described in the first chapter that I read. Drew, my research partner, she said, no, the failings of the court applied to all 110 men who were convicted, regardless of whether they received sentences and sentences, and regardless of whether they were executed. And so we decided that we would seek full retroactive clemency for all 110 men, which to us meant that the Army would have to acknowledge that they had failed to live up to their own values, that they had failed in their own regulatory processes, and that they had made a mistake, and that then they would restore honorable discharges to all of these men, which was incredibly important because along the way I got to work with family members of some of these men who had never lost sight of that original goal. Yes, sir.
Loving the information, Mr. Haymond. I had just 2 quick questions. One, incidents like this, where you have black people, and particularly black males, where they resort to counter violence and actually kill white people, those type of incidents really get buried, erased. We're not going to talk about that. I think that's a major contributor, and particularly with this incident, you have black males who are trained soldiers. These are not just black people who got upset and we're going to do something about racism. They're already trained. They know how to use a rifle, so there's going to be a very different response. Even they're going to be a lot more accurate if they go out and it's going to be some shooting. So if you could touch to that. And then the second question, the system of white supremacy, not just that was experienced by the black soldiers, but the black people in Texas in general that you talked about. My understanding of this incident, that it was racist police abuse of local citizens who were not even connected to the military, that had a huge impact on what led to all of this. Just if you could talk about that as well.
That actually is the catalyst that started the whole thing on the afternoon of August 23rd. These two police officers, Lee Sparks and Rufus Daniels, were a member of what was called the special officers. These are the horse-mounted officers in the Houston Police Department. They had a particular reputation of being racist bullies. They're riding into the San Felipe district, which is the black neighborhood. They see a group of young black men playing craps, shooting dice, right? Those guys scatter. Sparks proceeds to shoot at them and chase them through the neighborhood. He loses sight of the guy he's chasing, and he barges into the nearest house that he thinks this kid went into. And it turns out to be the home of a woman named Sarah Travers, who's a single mother of 5, working woman, who is, in that moment, wearing only a slip, ironing clothes. She has a baby about 8 months old. Sparks barges in and says, "Where's that blankety blank that I saw barge in here?" And she said, They wind up arresting her because she questions them. And then the first soldier, Private Edwards, sees her in distress. Neighbors are coming out of the house, and they're trying to bring her clothes so she can wear them. They're picking up her baby, which the police officers had dropped on the ground.
Oh.
And this kid, Private Edwards, he may have been drunk, he may not have been drunk. Doesn't matter, because he was on pass, he wasn't on duty. And no witness, whether white or black, has ever charged that Edwards threatened or came on aggressively. What it seems he said was he walked up and said, "Whatever she's done, I'll pay her fine if you'll just let her go home." Sparks pulls out his pistol and beats him down to the ground. Beat him so badly that he was covered in blood, so that when the battalion officers later that afternoon came to pick him up at the police station, they decided, no, they need to leave him in the police station overnight because he looks so bad. They want to wait until the morning when they can bring him a fresh uniform so he doesn't look like he's been beaten half to death by a cop. About an hour later, Corporal Baltimore comes on the scene. And it's his job. He is supposed to liaise with the civilian police and ask what's going on. So he walks up to these two in what he later in his own statement said, what I believe was a respectful manner. And most witnesses corroborate that. Sparks said, "What you got to do with this?" Pulls out his pistol and hits him over the head. Baltimore's a pretty big, athletic young man. Here's the thing that troubles me more about this than anything else. Lee Sparks is exactly my size. 5'10", 180 pounds. White, middle-aged. Corporal Baltimore, on the other hand, is about 6 feet tall, goes about 195, and is an athletic, military-trained soldier. Baltimore makes no effort to fight back. He turns and discretion is the better part of valor. He hauls down the street. Sparks fires at him at least 3 shots. So, the only reason Sparks didn't kill Baltimore is because he missed. That is the catalyst that starts the whole thing. That incident right there.
And I think your first question was also just about
burying these sorts of
burying the
incidents
soldiers,
where
yeah.
black people resort to counter violence.
Yeah. Did you want to know more about like how this was buried, or specifically just the culture around that?
Both.
Well,
Yeah.
the one thing that I would say is, and this is the most important part in the research, was first of all, this was not a revisionist history, nor was it revisionist law. You must examine the law as the law was legal then, right? Like it or not, if that was the law, it's slightly disingenuous as a historian to say, and those people were really, really bad, and we would never do anything like that. We know damn well we are capable of making errors in our own time, in our own way. any of us who are honest enough to look at it. We wanted to prove that the law was wrong because it didn't even follow the laws it was back then, and it didn't. So we were able to prove that the law failed. The army failed their own soldiers in that time. Now, the other thing there is that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote frequently about this incident from the moment that it happened all the way through the trials, all the way through the aftermath and all that. Du Bois said, take note, you who would speak of Houston, this was not an ordinary outburst. And he specifically mentioned exactly the factors that you described. That, number one, these were not defenseless civilians. These were young military men who were capable of defending themselves, and that turned the whole table on everything. This is the only incident of racial violence in the first half of the 20th century where more white people were killed than black. Now that brings in the revenge factor sometimes. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was just trying to understand and clarify. I think you were saying the officer in Baltimore, was he
Corporal Baltimore.
Corporal. Was he African American or white? I'm a little confused
All the
about
soldiers in the battalion are black.
Right.
All the soldiers in the battalion are black except for their officers.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was white?
He's black.
He was black.
He's black. The police officers were white.
No, I know, but you said that, so that guy showed up to try to help out or something, and then the cop shot at him. Was he an officer?
Soldier.
A soldier, okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, I was just getting confused because I'm trying
how many
to...
of you ever been in the military? Right, so in military terms, officer means a specific rank. You can't just use it interchangeably with soldier. So soldiers is everybody, but the officers are the ones who have the more authority. And in a black battalion in that era, all the commissioned officers were white. All the non-commissioned officers and soldiers were black.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Oh, I guess it like kind of follows up to what you asked and what you talked about. Like, so you mentioned like some historical events like Tulsa and Elaine. Would this like overshadow the Red Summer of 1919?
This is a direct precursor into it.
Right.
I'm really glad you brought up the Red Summer. If anyone doesn't know, the Red Summer of 1919 is when African American soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them in uniform, returning from service in France at the end of the war, are the subject of assault, numerous acts of violence targeted against them, specifically because they're black men in uniform. Some of them are small, one individual's targeted, others it's an entire group. So the Red Summer, there's a wave of racist violence that impacts the entire United States. It's not just in the South. It's in the North. It's in places like Chicago and New York City.
Arizona.
Yes, it's places that are normally considered not to have those problems. I actually found some documents that suggested that local politicians and law enforcement referred to the Houston incident when they were talking about how they should crack down on returning soldiers from France who are black, who may have gotten ideas. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I just want to follow up again. Okay, so just to understand, so it sounds like the impetus for the soldiers who decided to go back and, with their guns and whatever, start this, so-called incident, was that because they thought their friend had just been murdered or been beaten or something? And
That's
they
what
were
made them
pissed
angry.
off? Yeah.
That's what made them angry. They didn't react out of anger. They reacted out of fear. They thought they were under a viable threat.
Weren't they at the bait?
When the 150 soldiers marched out of camp that night at about 8:30, 8:45 that evening, they did so believing they were going out to face an oncoming armed mob of white people.
Why didn't they just stay? I mean, I'm just saying, why didn't they just stay at the fort or whatever?
That is an incredibly valid question because the senior non-commissioned officer who led them out, First Sergeant Vida Henry, he's the one who says, we're going out. Force on force, which is a military option. The junior non-commissioned officers, the other black sergeants, like, wait. We have 3.5 rifle companies here in camp. We've got almost 500 men armed. We can defend this position from a static defense. Let's stay and fight it out here. Henry's like, no, we're taking the fight to them. It's not until about 30 minutes later, in the dark, they get to a point called Shepherd's Dam Bridge, and they realize there is no mob coming to fight. At that point, people have already been killed. Shooting has happened. Now it's a question of what do they do next. So that's part of the story.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I just had a quick follow-up question with regard, and this one pertains more to like law, right? Like there's somebody who I admire and love and respect, Mark Lamont Hill. He once said, like a video I watched a few weeks ago where he said, crime is a social construct. I was wondering, like, couldn't, especially back then, even now, right? Like, law seems like a very arbitrary word and very arbitrary concept. Like, who's creating these laws and who it applies to, who it doesn't, and who decides to take it in their own hands, and you know what I mean? So how are you supposed to abide by certain laws if it's constantly,
the law changes, and it's whose perspective is being brought to bear, right?
Absolutely.
And there's a line from the book, if I can quote myself. Under Jim Crow, white people had justice. Black people had the law, and the law was designed to keep them under Jim Crow's heel. The law is not always the harbinger of justice, right? But there's another factor that has to always be considered in this particular case, and that's that these men were soldiers of the United States Army, just as I was myself. When they actually took the same oath of enlistment that I took, 100 years after them almost, that I solemnly swear that I will defend them. I, John A. Haymond, solemnly swear or affirm that I will uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign, domestic, etc., 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 right? So it's an anomaly of American justice that in order to serve in the U.S. military, you must first voluntarily relinquish some of the civil rights that you're determined to defend. Soldiers don't have freedom of speech. I know, it's an oxymoronic concept. Houston, the Harris County District Attorney after this wanted to try all of the alleged mutineers' riders, right? There was not a snowball's chance in hell that a black man could have stood up in a Harris County court in 1917 and gotten a fair trial. In fact, John Cricker, the DA, went on the record to say that he would only agree to the United States Army taking jurisdiction of the case if it could try and kill them as fast as he could.
Wow.
Now, the Army was not about to let a civilian determine the jurisdiction of their case. Soldiers fall under military law. The problem is that the law that should have protected them as soldiers was just trampled into the ground in this headlong rush to achieve a conviction. It's often been said, it's not original to me, that courts martials are designed to convict. Well, to give you an idea, the first trial, remember we said it's the largest murder trial in American history? 63 black soldiers, co-defendants, represented by one officer who is not a trained attorney, who is confronted by two senior JAG officers who are years of experience as civilian attorneys, plus a dedicated investigator team, plus the district attorney from Harris County, John Crooker, sitting at the table with them. They've had 2 months to prepare their case. The defense gets 10 days. So, right from the very beginning, it looks like the government's stacking the case as hard as it can.
And there are some fascinating moments about the law back in 1917 that you reference a lot. But your research led to the overturning of the convictions and actually clemency, which is incredible. And he talks a lot about the difference between pardon and clemency here, because pardon would actually mean that there was still guilt done. So what this research did was it got clemency. But what I'm really interested in is you have also mentioned that there was a number of separate efforts to kill the clemency effort in 2023, coming from inside agencies of the military or the federal government. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Let me read you the first paragraph of that epilogue, okay? I can't say it as well as I remember. It's rarely easy for people to admit an error. Errors that they feel may adversely reflect on them, even peripherally, can cause people to throw up barriers. Social scientists refer to this as conservatism bias. a reluctance to change your mind or position on a matter, even when provided with new evidence that challenges previously held beliefs. Institutions and organizations sometimes behave much the same way. During my military career and frequently since then, I've sometimes felt that the U.S. Army can be its own worst enemy when it comes to handling the sort of internal problems that might embarrass it. The Army has a manual for almost every conceivable task or operation that soldiers might have to undertake, and sometimes it seems there must be an unwritten manual for how to make a public affairs problem worse by handling it with astonishing ineptitude, or how to make a minor issue worse by trying to cover it up rather than simply dealing with it head on. So, first of all, the first opposition that we got when we started the clemency process was some well-intended people said, you're asking for too much. The government will never give you 110 clemencies for all 110 men. Ask for the 13 who were first executed in secret. And by the way, those first 13 executions were carried out within 3 days of the execution order being approved, with no chance for appeal and no outside review of the conviction. Nobody knew that they were going to die except for they themselves and about 5 other people. And that resulted in an immediate change in American law, which means that never again could any American soldier be put to death without the approval of the President of the United States in person.
Wow.
And it created the first appellate court system in the United States military. So a positive comes out of this. But when we started asking or building the case, first of all, there's pushback of, it's 100 years in the past. When is it far enough gone to just let it be the past? Well, justice is the door that should never be locked and the key thrown away. Second problem was the JAG, and by the way, in the military terms, when you say TJAG, you mean the Judge Advocate General, the 3-star general who's in charge of the entire legal system in the U.S. military and the Army. The TJAG at that time, who I left nameless in the book, objected based on there has to be, historic court cases have to be allowed to stand without being constantly criticized and reevaluated. To which my response was, if you ever find another case where the injustices and the procedural irregularities are so egregious as this one, then it ought to be challenged. There are 5,861 pages, if I'm remembering this correctly, of trial transcripts from all 3 trials. I only know of 3 people who've read all 5,861 pages. 2 other than me. When the JAG consented to review our petition, they assigned those 5,861 pages to 10 officers, 10 military attorneys, and each of them took a section and read it. Well, the problem with that is, if all you're reading is trial number 3, U.S. v. Tillman, and you're reading statements of the government's witnesses, you won't know that they perjured themselves over and over and over, or that the Army prosecutor asked leading questions to steer his witnesses into answers he had already determined that he'd want to give them. You don't know that unless you compare it to the first trial. You have to read them both, because you'll see where they change their story along the way. Thirdly, and this happened 3 days before the clemency was announced by the Secretary of the Army, Christine Worman, in November of 2023. The TJAG said, you can't do this. If you award clemency on such a huge scale, it's going to precipitate this avalanche of other appeals. To which our response was, no. If it was unjust, it's unjust. Last shot across the bow was, if we do this, it will open the Army to untold millions of dollars in reparations. Okay. Turns out, there's a precedent case that I found when I was writing my counter to this, and that is that in 2012, the government passed a law that says descendants and next of kin are entitled to reparations and benefits of soldiers who are unjustly convicted, but it's capped at the pay rate that they were at then. We're talking about 1917. Nobody's going to get rich off of this. Even with interest payment, you might get, one person might get $100,000 if they can prove a direct family connection. So they tried over and over to shoot a hole in this thing. And there was one secret weapon that they did not know about, which is that the Deputy General Counsel of the Army at that time, he and I were in the same infantry battalion decades ago. When he was a young captain, I was an even younger sergeant. And he would pick up the phone and say, "Hey, John, you need to call the Secretary of the Army now because X, Y, Z." So after the third time I did that, the Secretary of the Army was like, "Mr. Haymond, how are you getting all your intelligence?"
Your students don't stand a chance.
Plausible deniability, man. So.
Yes, blue shirt in the back.
Do you think this tragedy saved the lives of the Chicago 50 in 1944? Because they were also tried mutiny for not loading ships.
The Port Chicago Mutiny,
Yeah.
it absolutely did, because General Order Number 7 that goes into effect in January of 1918 prohibits ever again any summary execution of an American soldier. It also saves the lives of 43 other African American soldiers here in Washington in 1943 who were convicted in the U.S. v. Alston case at Fort Lawton, which is just over the way. They were accused of mutiny and murder in almost exactly the same sort of scenario, just smaller numbers. And I was very proud of the fact that the clemency got approved because it was the largest act of retroactive clemency in American history. I had that claim for 6 months because the Secretary of the Navy looked at what the Army had did with this case and said, "No, wait a second. If the Army can do that, can't we do that with Port Chicago?" And so more than 200 and I believe it's like 240 some African American sailors who have been court-martialed and given back conduct discharges, dishonorable discharges, are restored to honor because of that.
And some of them are still alive.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They can still actually receive theirs in person.
Yes.
So,
I think we have time for one more question in the back.
So my question is about the introduction. In the introduction, you do the usual thing of explaining what you're going to talk about, going over the military terminology, telling the audience why it's important. But something I found rather surprising and unexpected in the novel is that you also tell the audience exactly how you plan to tell the story, which is unapologetically and in a very direct manner. And I was wondering.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that last word. Directly and unapologetically what?
I'm so sorry, say it again.
The question is, you go over in the beginning military terminology and how you talk about the book, but she's pointing out that you also do it in a very unapologetic and direct manner.
Absolutely.
And then I think there was more you wanted to say?
I was just saying that you also say that you plan on being direct and unapologetic, and I was wondering why you felt the need to also explain how you plan on telling the story in addition to what you plan to tell.
So if you didn't hear the question is she's interested in understanding more about why he felt the need to tell how he was going to tell the story, and why he wanted to explain that in the beginning. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great.
I'm really glad you asked that because I had to fight to get that note on language and terminology in the book. First of all, the history is incredibly controversial. And I made the decision that I was not going to censor a single word from the original documents. We're talking about a history of racism, violent racism, where racial slurs are just polluting the records, newspaper stories, government records, trial transcripts, interview transcripts. You cannot get away from the racially offensive language. Now, the last thing the world needed was another middle-aged white man using the N-word 97 times in the course of a single book. But if that word's not in there, we don't see what those men had to endure. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was the deliberate, constant insult, the deliberate denigration of who they were, and the absolute disregard and disrespect shown to them as soldiers of their nation. If we don't see and hear and feel the language that they had to deal with, that confronted them, and the language that they protested against and stood up against, then we will not ever be able to understand what they dealt with, what pressures they were under, all the mitigating factors that they were denied in their trials. Because there were matters of mitigation that the defense counsel, for reasons that I theorize, chose to not bring up in their defense. And just in case you think that the story is not dramatic enough, after the last trial was concluded, the defense counsel is given an official note by the prosecutor in which he is praised for having never forgotten his obligation to the government and for not raising the matter of race in the court. And that, nobody knew that until 2022 when we found his personal scrapbook in the archives at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. So.
I imagine along that line, you also get asked quite a bit, to just give you a final question here. As a white man writing about this, how many times and how do you deal with the question about the white savior complex?
There's an expression we use, especially in combat arms units in the Army, in the infantry. You got people of all different colors. You might have 3 or 4 Smiths or Jones, right? One might be black, one might be white, one might be indeterminate. So how do you say, are you talking about black Jones or are you talking about white Jones? We don't say white or black. We say, do you mean dark green Jones or light green Jones? Because we're all Army green. We're all soldiers. Soldiers identify ourselves first and foremost as that. There's a brotherhood there. There's a commonality. There's a shared bond that transcends some of those other social constructs. And so early on when I started working on this case, when I agreed to serve as the lead historian for the clemency case, which took me some time to agree to, I approached it from, this is not about a white person doing something that a black person couldn't do for themselves. Because, let's be honest, people have been advocating for those 110 men for a century. What it needed was the right combination of people with the right combination of knowledge and skill. Somebody who could work from the inside of the system. Soldiers advocating for soldiers. That's how I approached the entire thing. I'm a soldier of the 21st century, or I was until I retired in 2009. And I felt the soldiers a century before me had been mistreated. And I wanted their story out. And I wanted to try to change their record. So.
And I'm really glad you did. Book is Black Soldiers, White Laws. It's phenomenal. Mr. Haymond, I really appreciate how you tell the story of how these are people. And I'm really glad that you did this research. And thank you for having me do this too. So. Any last questions can be addressed to Mr. Haymond afterwards, and I believe there is a book signing at the back. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. I know the traffic around here is horrible and parking is
Yes.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. No problem. You're a victim. Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.